Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast, The Joyful Frugalista, and now here's your host, Serina Bird.
Hello, I'm super excited to share the good news that I have written another book, How to Pay Your Mortgage Off in 10 Years, responds to the cost of living crisis that many people find themselves in. Whether you are paying off a mortgage, you've paid off a mortgage, you aspire to buy a house and have a mortgage, or you know someone who does have a mortgage, this book will have lots of frugal tips and tricks as well as some finance hacks for you. Thank you so much. Yuma Frugalistas, and welcome. Today I have a special guest, and of course all of my guests are special. Today we are going to talk about cons, scams, intimate partner fraud, and internet dating. Areas where women in particular are especially vulnerable. But first, I have a favour to ask of you. If you enjoy this podcast and find it useful for you, please pay it forward by sharing with a friend. And even better, please follow this podcast, The Joyful Frugalista. I really love comments as well. According to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, in 2022, Australians lost a record $3.1 billion to scams, which is an 80% increase on total losses from the year before. The ACCC notes that while Australians lost more money to scams than ever before in 2022, the true cost of scams is more than just the dollar figure, as they also cause emotional distress to victims, their families, and businesses. And I see my guest is nodding to all of this. The cost of scams is something that Tracy Hall knows well. She is author of The Last Victim, the full story behind the relationship made famous by the hit podcast, Who the Hell is Hamish? I listened to that podcast on a long-distance driving trip and was transfixed by the story of Hamish McLaren, who was known by many other names, who conned an estimated 80 to 100 million over several decades. The first episode I listened to told the story of his partner at that time, Tracy Hall, who's our guest today. She's now written about her experience, and today she's going to share a bit with us here. Wow, Tracy, what a story.
It's a story, all right.
Thank you so much for your courage in sharing this. Was it hard to come out and start talking about this?
I think in the beginning it was, because when Hamish was arrested, I didn't really have that much information. It was very difficult for the police to talk to me. His family wouldn't talk to me. I couldn't find any friends that would talk to me. And really what I was trying to do was piece together the previous 18 months of my life. And during that time, I was not in a good way. You speak about emotional kind of impact of things, scams and intimate fraud. And for me, that was hugely debilitating. And it wasn't until about a year after Hamish was arrested that I felt strong enough to go and talk to Greg Bearup, who was the journalist from The Australian who did the podcast. And I had been asked to speak to him quite a few months before that, and I just couldn't do it. And, part of that was, it was just so incredibly hard to talk about it. It was so hard to admit to myself that this had actually happened, and the shame that I felt was overwhelming.
And I think a lot of people don't talk about this as well. There's a lot of this that is happening that people just don't talk about because it is really hard to admit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. And there were people that lost money to Hamish that didn't make statements, that didn't come forward in this case. So that's why we know that the total losses are actually a lot more than what he was charged for. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And some of them I fully understand. So there's obviously shame and the emotional kind of impact that it has on not only the individual but the family. It's reputational risk. To come out and say that you've lost your life savings is a huge risk for some people and their reputations. There's a career risk associated with it. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people don't. But for me, it was something that after I got through that first year, essentially, I felt very passionate about this story being told. I felt very strongly about not feeling ashamed because this man is a professional, and these schemes and these scams are run by professionals. And if I can come forward and say, well, this happened to me and I never thought it would happen to me, then it can happen to anyone. And that's part of the reason I talk about this. It's the reason I wrote the book. It's the reason I feel so strongly about this issue.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you did. And I think often these sort of things are dismissed as silly women issues, but not all of Hamish's victims were women, were they?
That's right. I mean, he fooled businessmen. There were business advisors to women-led companies that advised the owners of the company to invest with him. There were husband and wives. There were, at the time he was arrested, I was the only one in an intimate relationship with him. Everyone else was sort of in a business relationship. But that's right, Serina. It's like, and in the past, I feel like the media have, I'm not going to say done a bad job, but I would watch those shows on those news programs, so Current Affair, those kind of things, all the articles that you read online, and it might be those 5-word headlines that are just very clickbaity. It's like vulnerable divorcee loses life savings or evil love scam and things like this, which are all very salacious, and they get the clicks and they get people to watch. But what they don't do is show the true nature of how insidious this type of fraud is. And what it does in our heads is it makes us think, or conjures up images, I think, and this is what happened to me when I watched these programs, of, a lonely middle-aged woman sitting in a lounge room looking for love on the internet, or sending money to someone she's never met before in a foreign country. And I sat there and I thought, you know what, that would never happen to me. I'd never do that. And I wouldn't. Yet here I am. I met somebody online. We had a real life, in-person, intimate, long-term relationship, and I lost my life savings. So it actually doesn't matter how it happens, but the way that it had been portrayed to me was a way that I couldn't relate to. And so therefore I dismissed it and thought, well, that will never happen to me. And so what I'm very keen, and what's been great about the media and the interest that's been around who the hell is Hamish, and I think this was kicked off by The Australian, to be honest, was the way in which they handled the story, and the way in which the media have handled my story has been so generous and so reflective of the way in which it was intended, which was to act as a warning siren for other people, women particularly, because it can happen to anyone. And that's what I wanted to be clear, as opposed to those big salacious headlines.
Look, I really, really felt for you when I heard you on the podcast, and there are a number of reasons. And I guess a big one was that I was on the online dating scene in 2015, 2016 as well. And throughout most of 2016, I was dating someone who, in my first book, I call Mr. Red Sports Car, who lived a fairly flashy life. No, seriously, he bought a new BMW while we're dating. I was like, what the hell? But, clearly living beyond his means. It wasn't a lifestyle I aspired to. Now, he was not a fraudster, but there are a lot of things that I sort of went, oh, it's a bit strange. It's a bit uncomfortable, a bit hot and cold, different sorts of messages. Didn't have a lot of friends at that time because he was going through a divorce. And so particularly when I read your book, I could so relate to that, because that could have been me.
Yeah. I mean, it could be any of us. And I think the thing too with these people like Hamish that really go deep on a relationship, whether it be an intimate one or otherwise, is that they can almost sniff out a vulnerability or a weak point. And in my case, Hamish became whatever I wanted him to be. So whatever I expressed about what I wanted for my own life, what my values were, what my morals were, how I wanted to spend my time, he reflected that back to me in a way that matched. So very good at mirroring. And of course, when someone does that to you, you naturally trust them more. You follow, I fell in love with him because I thought, wow, what a great guy. Like this is my person. And they're very, very clever at doing that. And yeah, it is obviously, in retrospect, I've seen all of the red flags and I point those out.
You do.
Quite well in the book. There are some very strong warning signs that I had my rose-coloured glasses on, and we all know if you're wearing your rose-coloured glasses, all the red flags are just flags, and I didn't see them, and it's not until I've had this time to reflect where I can actually point those out.
Well, let's talk about the red flags, but before we do, I think it's important to acknowledge that when someone is in love, does have that effect on our brains, doesn't it? It's like the oxytocin, everything.
Yeah, it's that. And then one of the really interesting things that I've learned and kind of delved deep into is sort of like the biology of trust and why we trust and why our intuition sometimes fails us. And that's been a really interesting journey for me because we live in a world where you have to trust. We're biologically wired to trust from the moment that we're born. Otherwise, we wouldn't believe that we could survive, I guess. And these invisible contracts of trust that we operate within, things like you go to the doctor and you don't ask whether the doctor that's assessing you has a medical degree. You don't question the medication that they give you. You hop on an aeroplane and you don't swing left with your portable breathalyzer and go ask the pilots to blow into the nozzle. You just trust that they haven't been drinking and that they're going to get you to where they, so you start to think about these things, right? And we are so wired to trust. And then everywhere around us, this is how our society operates, because if it didn't, then it wouldn't work, right? And we are so used to that. So then when someone comes into your life and says, my name is Max Tavita and I'm 41 years old and I'm a chief investment officer of a family office, I'm the last person. And I don't think anyone would go, well, I need 100 points of ID and you need to take me to your workplace and introduce me to your boss and you need to do this and this. Because we just trust that people are telling us the truth. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of things that I've learned throughout. And in addition to the trust issue, we have all these biases, right? So I have a similarity bias. So if someone looks, sounds, feels, speaks like me, I'm really naturally going to trust and love them. And that's what he did. He basically reflected me back in his form. We have so many I have an optimism bias. I think the best of everyone. I just met you tonight, but I think, wow, what a great person. Look at what you're doing. This is
think
incredible.
you're pretty fabulous too. So right back at you.
Thank you. But we have all these biases and you put them all together, right? And suddenly your intuition is overridden, I guess. And when you start to think about things like that, there is actually no way I would have ever guessed that the person that told me that he loved me and we were building a future together was also at the same time, there was not one part of me that believed or felt that it was a bit weird.
Yeah. So let's go back to these red flags. So you mightn't have seen the red flags because you're in love and you're trusting and you're optimistic. Although from reading your book, I've learned that you did have a friend who did see the red flags, at least initially until she met him and was charmed. So what were, with the benefit of hindsight, when you're able to forensically look at this, what were some of the red flags?
I think in terms of the dating scenario, if somebody doesn't have a digital profile or a digital footprint, that is a massive red flag. In this day and age, if there is nothing at all written on the internet about you, massive red flag. It's one thing not to have a social profile or social media handles, and that I have friends of my age that don't and choose not to. But if there's nothing on the internet about you at all, then big red flag. And Hamish would tell these stories and I would go and look them up, like the plane crash that he said his parents and he were in, and I would go and look that up. But of course that never existed because A, it never happened, but B, it wasn't his name. And at the time I was very distracted and tired, so I just sort of let it go and forgot about it. I think if you're not meeting friends and family quite quickly into a relationship, like I'm talking within the first month or two, then I think there's something fishy about that. And in Hamish's case, he had an excuse for everything, but at the end of the day, he did have family. They were in Canberra. And he just it was always a future promise. Yeah, we'll do that next weekend. Or no, we'll do that in 2 weekends' time. And of course, I was a single mum, so I didn't have a lot of time available. And when we did get time together, he would say all the right things. Like, I just want to spend time with you, Trace. And, we don't get a lot of time together, so I just wanted to be asked for tonight. Let's do that in 2 weeks' time. So there was those kind of things.
And that's hard really, because there is this sort of modern thing of stashing where people kind of don't necessarily want to introduce a partner to their family or for other things, that they sort of just put it on a shelf. They have a separate life. Yeah, there are people who do that. And in certain cultures too, they don't introduce to family until things are fairly serious.
Yeah. And I appreciate those things. I guess it's more just something to be curious about. What are the reasons? And I think had I've met some more people that were connected to Hamish, maybe it would have slipped that his name was not Max, his name was Hamish. I did meet people throughout the time that we were together, and what I realised is you actually don't use people's names very often in conversations.
Not in Australian culture, at least. We don't tend to use titles and names that much.
No, we have nicknames for everything. And there was this one example where he had a friend over at his apartment. There's someone a boy he grew up with, and we were just there in the lounge room reading the papers, talking, and his friend called him Hambone. And at the time I was sort of like, oh, that's weird. And then we went out for a walk afterwards, and I said, oh, how come he calls you Hambone? And of course it was for Hamish, but I knew him as Max. But as quick as a flash, he goes, oh, well, when I was a kid, I was super, super skinny, had really skinny legs, and everyone said that I needed to put some weight on, so they needed more ham on my bones. So they called me Hambone. And it was the quickest response you could have ever heard, almost like he'd had to say this lie before. I don't know. But this is how good he was. It was like anything that came up, he could have, because, there were times I met people in his life and he would have been crapping himself that they were going to call him Hamish in front of me. But he just kind of took the risk, and I don't know, I guess he was pretty cocky and pretty confident, and never happened.
Yeah, well, lucky for him. But from listening to the podcast, there were other incidences where with other people he's defrauded, they did call him Hamish and he made a joke of it. So I'm sure he's probably had practiced that line as well.
Yeah, 100%. And most other people knew him as Hamish McLaren. Like, I seem to be the only one that knew him as Max DeVita during that time. I think he was building a new identity, to be honest. But
you think he was building a new identity?
I do, yeah. There was official documentation that was in his letterbox that I took out of his letterbox, whether he planted it there or he was starting to change his name on electricity accounts or something like that. I'm not sure, but I would pull mail out of his letterbox, take it up to his apartment, and of course it was to Max DeVita. So he'd either planted it there, which is another elaborate kind of trick of his to make me believe or make it seem all legitimate, or he could have been sort of starting to build this new identity by getting his name onto electricity accounts or whatever it might be.
So the normal sorts of things you would do if you were, dating someone you're a bit suspicious, they all sort of, other than not meeting immediate family and so forth, they seemed to stack up, didn't they? Like the mail in the mailbox, you'd seen where he lived, you saw the cars he drove.
Yeah, and we travelled into work together. If I'd stayed there on a particular night, there was a work day the next day, we'd get dressed together and go and do our corporate jobs. He would drop me off on the street and say, look, I'll just drop you here because I need to park 4 floors down. My office is here. He used to send me pictures of the inside of his office, his desk set up at work, what they ate at lunch. I don't even know where. He probably just got these photos off the internet, but of course I didn't suspect anything. And I'd toddle off to work down the street and say goodbye. And he never had a job there. He never had an office there. I think he just drove back to Bondi and put his board shorts back on and got on with his day. So very elaborate. It was almost like a movie that he created to make it seem like the story that he told me was real, even down to like the conversations I overheard with people. I don't know who these people were. I still don't really know who these people were, but they were real people on the other end of the phone talking about investment deals and the price of different stocks and trades and closing markets and opening markets and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know who he was talking to, but it all seemed very legitimate.
So you were there, you had a professional career, working very busy, going through separation, single parenting, balancing all sorts of activities, your daughter's doing all of that. And he's coming across as though he's really knowledgeable with finance. So how did he get to that? Well, how did you get to that point where you made your first investment, and I'm using investment in inverted commas because, of course, it wasn't a real investment. So, like, how did that come about?
He had started talking to me. The very first one was he had started talking to me about an opportunity that he was privy to as part of his job, investing at the family office. And he came to me and he said, look, this is sort of happening. It's going to be a great opportunity. My sister and my brother-in-law are investing, and I do their investments for them on the side. And she said to me, why don't you talk to Trace about this? And he was sort of all like, look, I don't normally mix business with my personal relationships, but you work so hard. You know, he did the big spiel. You work so hard. You work harder than anyone I've ever met. I want you to be financially independent. If this is a way that I can help you get there, then please consider it. And he told me a bit more. We had a few more conversations, and that's when I sort of made the decision to do that. And that was sort of the first one. But the big amount of, you know, the big chunk of money that I lost was my 20-year career superannuation.
Ouch.
Yeah, it was a lot. And over the year leading up, we'd had countless conversations, of course, about finance and his line of work and what he was skilled at and his profession, etc. And then he started asking me after about a year, who's your superannuation with? And what kind of returns do you get? And what fees do they charge? And a lot of that information, I was kind of like, most people I didn't really know. I wasn't really that on top of it. And then he started kind of being really vocal about the fees that you pay and how they're thieves and they take your money and they're not working hard enough for you. And I could make that money work so much harder for you. You should see the returns that my clients get at the family office. And of course, I'd listened to this the whole year. And then my confirmation bias kicked in. And by the time he asked me to manage my superannuation, I was recounting the hundreds of conversations we'd had about money, thinking, well, of course he's the perfect person to do it. And so I set up a self-managed super fund, which he pretty much groomed me through. He basically helped me do it. And it was all set up legitimately. The bank account was set up legitimately. Everything was done correctly. And when it came time to taking the money from my existing superannuation and putting it into my self-managed, we did all of that properly. But then to invest it, he was doing it through a trading firm. And I wrote out a check to that trading firm thinking that it was going into my account, which I had set up and done all the paperwork for. But unfortunately, that check went into an account of his. And that's how he sort of washed the money through. So that's how he did it. He basically groomed me through the whole process that lasted more than a year.
Wow, that's like a really long-term fraud. This is not just an email from a Nigerian prince. And I laugh a bit about that because one of my good friends is currently Australian High Commissioner to Nigeria. And I've been asking her if she's found any wealthy princes yet. And so far not. But definitely real fraudsters are much more sophisticated. The lies are built on a grain of truth, obviously. And knowing which particular company you used to have your superannuation with, I know that they weren't necessarily the best in terms of their fees. So it wasn't necessarily the best product probably to start off with. And then, of course, the Banking Royal Commission was sort of starting a year or two after that. There was a lot of discussion about that particular company and how it wasn't performing well. So someone who presents as being really good with finance saying, well, you're not on the best product. Like, it sounds very feasible. Like, I think I probably would have fallen for it.
Yeah, 100%. And it was just everything he said leading up to that just confirmed that he was the right person to manage my financial future. We were talking about buying a house together. You know, the weekend before he got arrested, we were looking at properties in Byron Bay to purchase and thinking about our future up there together in the years ahead. And, you know, for all intents and purposes, he presented in exactly the way that he said he was and did. He provided false documentation to me showing the success of the fund and his investments. It was on, what looked like legitimate letterhead. He'd had it all printed out. He had Bloomberg monitors going the whole time at his home. Like, it just all made sense to me. And I didn't suspect that he would be doing this in the background. So I obviously didn't cotton on.
And adding to your red flags, and you talk about this in your book, was that you didn't have the account login details. That said, you're at a very busy time of your life. You probably didn't have time to log on to look at things anyway. I know I some days struggle with that. Like, how many different passwords and accounts do you need? But that was another thing, that you didn't have access to that information you could look up at any time.
100%. And I asked him for them multiple times. And again, it was sort of future. There was the future promise. Yeah, I'll get those to you when I'm back at my desk, or it's all in hand. My power of attorney is this woman. She's got it all. And I said, look, just what if something happens to you? I just need them. And he's like, yep, got it. Yep, got it. And then, of course, it would just never come. And this is another thing I talk about in my keynotes, is that vulnerability comes in a lot of forms. And yes, I was vulnerable because I was going through a divorce and a separation and everything that comes with that. But it was sort of a year down the track, and I felt like I was ready to meet someone. And yet I was vulnerable in other ways that I hadn't realized. So I was vulnerable because, exactly like you said, I was busy. I was working a huge job at eBay at the time. I was doing really long hours. I was vulnerable because I was tired. I was vulnerable because I was distracted, because I'm single parenting and trying to do the whole thing and get on top of that. There's different ways that you can be vulnerable, and they're not always the ways that you think you're going to be. And then, of course, there are huge events that happen in your life, like death. If a partner dies or a child dies, or divorce, hugely vulnerable after divorce, a major illness, diagnosed with an illness or someone close to you, a natural disaster. There are times in your life when you can be more vulnerable than others, but being vulnerable is being human, right? Like, it's just part of the human condition, and we're not going to stop being vulnerable anytime soon. And it's in those moments where often you can't see your own vulnerability because you're just getting through.
You're just coping.
That's where your community or your support network needs to take extra care of you. And that's one thing I say too, is even if you're not being conned or you're not in that state, if someone around you is going through one of those big life events, or you might see them being vulnerable, but they don't see themselves as being vulnerable, just keep an extra eye out, have an extra conversation, ask an extra question, and you may actually just help them out in a way that you wouldn't have thought possible.
Wise words from someone who's gone through it. And I know you did have a lot of support through some friends as you're recovering from this. But talking about the recovery, like, how useful were the police and their understanding of white-collar crime? Did they sit down and help you trace the money?
Well, no. I mean, it was such a big case, and it was unfolding as the weeks and months went on because other victims were coming forward. So he was arrested off the back of a couple of victims, and then they released the Crime Stoppers video, and then that's what I saw, and that's when I realised that he was who he was, and then the other victims came forward. So this process took months and months and months, of course, and they had to kind of accumulate all of our statements, all of the evidence, all the work. I mean, fraud is such a difficult thing to prosecute in our country. And yes, I would say they were helpful. They were always responsive. They couldn't always give me information that I asked for because it was a legal case at that point. And so I think that was a difficult thing. In retrospect, I think the police, I think Tom and his team did an incredible job at getting Hamish the longest sentence possible. It was a huge sentence for that type of crime in New South Wales based on what we'd seen. And he actually got a reduction because of that, because it was such a big sentence. I think what's difficult for all of the victims is that the main aim of the game was to get Hamish in jail for the longest period of time possible. And I don't believe that they're incentivized or not even wanting. I just don't think they have the resources, the time, the skills, the technology to go trace the money. And once money goes offshore, that's really difficult as well. So I think they did what they needed to do to get him the longest sentence possible. But that's kind of where it stopped, and that's where their remit stops as well. And what generally has to happen is you need to go get a private forensic investigator to go looking for you. And of course, when you've lost your life savings, no one can afford to do that. You can't afford to get a lawyer. You can't afford to do these things. So you just have to take the loss. I think what's interesting, and one thing I'd love to advocate for as we move through a time in our culture and our society where scams and fraud are becoming more and more, there's more focus from government bodies, from organisations, from platforms, that victim support is looked at. So it would have been heaps better for me if Hamish had come into my house, stolen my TV and put a gun to my head. Like, I would have gotten some really strong victim support through that. Now, in this case, there was no victim support. I had to pay for all my own therapy. There's just nothing for this. And all the victims were in the same boat. So you're basically navigating your way through the process, of which none of us have ever been through before, thank goodness. And then you're trying to deal with the emotional fallout, and you're having to fund and find that yourself. So it's tricky, because fraud is hard to prosecute, because in essence, you're freely giving your money to someone. They have to prove that they've deceived you into doing that. And that's not an easy thing to do currently in this country. So look, it's multifaceted. I think there's some ways to go. I think there's some things we can do. And if I can help advocate for victim support services off the back of something like this, then I would be more than happy to do that as well.
Well, thank you. I think you are doing a lot already to raise the profile of this and the loopholes that are there and the need for structural change. So, Tracy, thank you so much for allowing me to have you on my podcast. The Last Victim is in all good bookstores now. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you go and buy the book. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thanks for having me, Serina.
You've been listening to The Joyful Frugalista with Serina Bird. And of course, sound has been by Neil Hadley.
You could talk, and I would listen, I would understand your mind. Oh, I'd love to be with you, walking toward the sea, and the times when I'm lonely, you could be the one to comfort me every day. I am thankful that our separate paths have crossed. Every night I lay my head down, I know I'll never feel so lost. What if we cross the river? We could start a brand new life with a house and a family. If you'd only be my wife. So I leave it to you now. You can tell me what you think. We could step to the altar. I could wake up soon.